You're fired. The three words fell like a winter window pane shattering, clean, bright, impossible to ignore. Conversation in the glass-lined boardroom hummed back to life in the fraction of a second that followed. People looked down at their notepads, at their screens, at the small, messy life tucked into Gabriel Santos's palm, where his phone vibrated silently with a photo he never stopped carrying. Luna, knees tucked under her, grinning with a gap-toothed pride that always made him forget the rest of the world. Gabriel felt the weight of the words more than their sound. For a moment, he only saw them spelled out in the way the afternoon light cut across the conference table like a crown of cold white teeth. Laura Mendez, impeccable in a navy suit, hair pulled back so the line of her jaw was all the more severe, sat across from him with the expression of someone who had rehearsed saying hard things until they stopped hurting her. Around them, the company's executive team watched as if waiting for a signal. He swallowed. His mouth made no more noise than a man breathing on a long flight, but inside, something unclipped. Years of quietings, the small daily compromises to keep payroll and Luna's preschool fees covered, pulled taut and released. Shame nearly knocked him off balance. He felt how thin his safety net had always been, how delicate the arrangements that let him be both provider and parent. Gabriel rose slowly. He folded his hands on the back of his chair for a second, felt the familiar ridges of the wood under his fingers, and then he spoke. His voice was even. It carried the soft roughness of a man who had spent mornings tying tiny shoelaces and nights debugging software while Luna slept with her stuffed bear in the crook of his arm. "Okay," he said. "I understand." There were murmurs, some curious, some a little cruel. Colleagues exchanged glances that tasted of 1,000 small victories won in conference rooms much like this one. Laura's expression softened not a hair. She handed a slim envelope to Marta, who sat 2 seats down, neutral as a judge. Marta's lips pressed into a line only Gabriel knew how to read: Manager Protocol, Damage Control. He put his jacket on the chair and made for the door with the slow, graceful precision of someone rehearsed in farewells. No pleading, no scene, no begging for something that had been withheld by design. On the way out, he felt the scrape of someone's eyes on him, an interest that had nothing to do with kindness. He thought of Luna waiting by the window in their small apartment, her hot cocoa in a cup with a cartoon whale, the way she'd pressed her entire forehead against his one morning when she was 3 and had insisted she smell his hair because it smelled like home. That image folded him in half and held him steady. When the hallway swallowed him and the cool, recycled air of the building hit his face, his phone buzzed. He stopped and saw Laura's name lighting the screen. He almost did not answer. He had rehearsed many exits in his head, but not the follow-up call when he had already accepted the humiliation with quiet dignity. "Mr. Santos," Laura said, her voice far less formal now, the edges sanded down. "Can you step back into my office? 10 minutes. He hesitated only a beat and then turned back, because hope is an animal that sometimes arrives in the same clothes as obedience. They closed the door. Laura removed her jacket, revealing the white blouse beneath, unremarkable, and for the first time he noticed a faint bruise of fatigue at the corner of her mouth. Someone sleeping too little, someone carrying responsibility like a second skin. She seated herself, and for a heartbeat there was the kind of silence that is not empty, but pregnant with the unsaid. "You have a lot of people under you who count on you," Laura said. 300. "If you fail, they lose more than a manager. You understand that." The words had the excuse of truth. Her hands, precisely folded on the desk, betrayed no tremor. It was a defense she'd built into the very architecture of her leadership. Decisions must be made swiftly, painfully, if a company was to survive. He saw finally what she had been testing. She had wanted to witness him crumble, to see whether a man who looked so small in a suit could, under the pressure of the worst possible news, become someone else. He felt fury bloom like a bruise beneath the skin. "I understand responsibility," Gabriel said. "I also understand dignity. You didn't need to humiliate me to prove anything." Laura's mouth softened. "You think I wanted this?" "I don't know what you wanted," he said. "What I know is you put me in front of everyone and said," he repeated, the words tasting like iron, "you're fired." There it was. He said it, and it landed between them like a coin on a table, heavy and scorching. Laura's expression finally broke, a sliver of something she tried to hide. Remorse, maybe, or the recognition that power can be clumsy and cruel. "It was a test," she said, "an awful way to put it, a stupid test maybe. I'm sorry. I wanted to know if, under pressure, you'd still do the right thing for the company. Our shareholders were about to force a restructuring that would have lost jobs. I had to be sure the managers I promoted could handle decisions without thinking small." He felt the explanation like a door opening onto a hallway with no light. No absolution, just reason. It didn't make the moment any less sharp. He pinched the bridge of his nose, and for an instant his eyes burned. "And?" he asked. Laura reached into a drawer and placed a packet on the desk. The paper felt ceremonial, the kind of language that transforms life into ledger entries. Title change, compensation lines, benefits. He read the numbers and felt warmth and cold in the same place. Director of Technology, salary increased, stock options, better health coverage, a plan for Luna's education. Promises rendered in bullet points. I can't accept this without—" He paused. Rage and gratitude tangled into a tough knot. "This was humiliating. It was risky. You can't just—" "I know," Laura interrupted, her voice low. "And I know you're furious. You should be. I'm asking you to accept the position because you earned it, not because I forced your hand. I made a choice, one I regret in how I enacted it, but the decision stands. I am offering it to you because I've watched your work. I believe in it." She leaned back, and for the first time she let vulnerability show like an odd, misplaced jewel. "We inherit broken things. I inherited a company with a board that wanted quick teeth. I can't keep letting fear run the ship. So I pushed this test too far. I'm sorry." He looked at her, really looked, and saw not the iceberg of a CEO, but the human tiredness that made up her life. He thought of his daughter's laugh, Luna's sticky fingers. If the promotion would mean more nights not waiting for rent notices in the mail, if the stock options could mean a college fund, if better insurance meant a peace he had only sometimes tasted, he found the anger shifting imperceptibly toward the practical. "Promise me one thing," he said. "If I say yes, the humiliation stays in this room. No grand announcements that I proved myself. No stories told to flatter your board." Laura's eyes lifted. "It won't be used that way," she said. "I'll apologize, publicly, if you allow it. HR will handle a statement. And if you want to move to a different department to avoid complications, we can do that. Martha will oversee the transition." She said the name like an anchor. Marta. Always present, always sensible. Gabriel thought of Marta's quiet hands, the way she managed the company's emotional tremors with the same practiced calm she used to cut paper. He had worked with her for years. She had been a buffer between mercy and policy. He folded the offer into his palm and felt the weight of decision. Pride warred with survival in a way that had nothing to do with the size of the paycheck. He saw Luna's face in the picture on his phone, and then looked back at Laura with a clarity that surprised him. "I accept," he said finally, "but not without an apology of my own. You hurt people today. We can't pretend that doesn't matter." Laura nodded, and when she spoke it was as if she had been spared something monstrous. "You're right. I will apologize. And we'll write policies that protect employees from that kind of test. I owe you, personally and professionally, an explanation and a correction." Before Gabriel could respond, the conference room door opened and Marta slipped in, small and efficient. She took in the room, measured the air, and set the course they all silently needed. "We will file the paperwork," Marta said, "and we'll draft a public statement if both of you agree. For the relationship between you two," here her voice took on the kind of gravity HR sometimes borrows from courtrooms, "we need a disclosure. It's standard. It's about protecting the company and protecting you. all outline options, transfer, reporting lines that avoid direct supervision, and a review period. Gabriel's chest unclenched a tiny bit at Marta's measured competence. He had always liked rules when they spelled out an honest path. They made things knowable. He nodded. "One more thing," he said, the words surprising him for their steadiness. "If it isn't just about the company, if there's anything else you expect from me, say so now. I will not be someone you can toss aside because you needed to know something. I'm a father. I have a life." Laura's hand hovered over the promotion packet and then rested on it. "I understand," she said, "and I don't expect anything else." There was a brittle honesty to their exchange that unsettled but didn't betray them. When the meeting adjourned, the corridor felt different. People returned to their beverages and their inboxes, to their calendars and their small private triumphs. Gabriel walked back through the glass doors into the world, the offer secure in his hand, but with a cold residue on his tongue that would take longer than a single apology to dissolve. If this story is resonating with you, consider subscribing for more stories that explore love, ethics, and the messy paths people take to find both. When he reached the elevator, a coworker tapped him on the shoulder and offered a weak smile, half congratulatory, half embarrassed. Gabriel gave a nod that meant less than the 100 small assurances he had conjured for himself. He wanted to tell that coworker nothing, to keep the humiliation private and the victory lukewarm. The elevator hummed, the city slid past in a blur of reflective glass. He thought of how often life reduced to small transactions, a suit for a title, a test for a promotion, a silence for a promise. By the time he reached his stop, the city sunlight had changed, slanting into long shadows across the sidewalk. The walk to his apartment felt longer than usual. He clutched the promotion packet under his arm like a manuscript that had not yet been accepted by a skeptical world. He opened the door to the small two-bedroom and was met by a blast of small life. Toys scattered like confetti, laundry that never finished itself, the smell of cinnamon and something burnt, a pan, no doubt. Luna barreled into him, a hurricane in a princess dress and mismatched socks, shrieking with the kind of joy that punctured everything else. "Daddy! Daddy!" She wrapped herself around his leg with the kind of unself-conscious affection that made him wonder every day how he had been so lucky. He scooped her up and held her like a ship clinging to a buoy. Her breath smelled of the cocoa from earlier, sweet with a hint of marshmallow. He felt the sadness of the day ease a fraction, soothed by the simple geometry of her body against his. "Guess what?" she said. "Miss Paula read us a story today about a rocket, and I told her about your rocket office. She said rockets are grave." "You told your teacher about my office?" he asked, and she nodded, eyes wide with pride. "You're going to be a director, Daddy, like a real director?" she asked. He looked down at her, thought of the checkbook and the calendar and the list of things in his head to fix and afford. "Yes," he said, "I'm going to work a little differently. We might have more cookies, or maybe a bigger cookie." Luna giggled, the noise like marbles rolling across wood. "Yay!" she said, and then more seriously, "Can you read me the rocket book?" He carried her to the couch, placed her in his lap, and opened a thin picture book with a worn spine. As he read, he noticed the way Luna's fingers trailed over the pictures, the way she turned to him with a look that asked for more than a bedtime story. It asked for presence in a way that the boardroom had never needed to be. There was a knock at the door, light and hesitant. When Gabriel opened it, Laura stood there in jeans and a sweater she usually reserved for weekends. Her hair was loosened from its corporate restraint, and the soft lines of her face had the kind of honesty found only in rare private hours. She looked as if she had reconsidered something huge and decided to come small. "I was in the neighborhood," she said, and both of them smiled. Awkward, protective, not yet friends, but no longer merely boss and subordinate.
Thought I'd, if it's okay, drop off dinner for you and Luna." He felt his chest lurch in that odd way it does when someone brings exactly what you need at the precise moment you need it. He accepted her into their cramped kitchen, noticing the way Luna stared at Laura with a simple appraisal that lacked the filters adults slotted into their gazes. They ate around the coffee table, plates balanced on knees, forks clinking, the apartment filling with laughter that sounded foreign in Laura's ears, so used to muted conference rooms and silent elevators. Luna told stories with the wild timeline of a child, today's rocket compared to yesterday's playground victory, while Laura listened, genuinely, the way someone who had spent most of her time listening for the sound of approval did when she found a new pattern that delighted her. At one point, Luna toddled up to Laura, thrusting a crayon in her hand with heroic generosity. "Color with me," she demanded. Laura looked surprised, then delighted. She sank to the floor and colored with the kind of concentration adults lose when the world is only about lines and bright pigments. Gabriel watched them. The scene nudged at something in him, suspicion and gratitude braided into a fragile trust.
Later, when Luna was in bed and the apartment hummed with the soft white noise of an old refrigerator, they sat at the small table where the offer packet still lay like a marker of the day's events. "You didn't have to come," Gabriel said. "I know not everyone can do this. The whole—" He gestured vaguely at the life that included a child, an apartment, a dinner plate with leftover sauce. "I wanted to," Laura said simply. "I wanted to see you outside the office, see who you are when the calculations don't matter, and to apologize again in a way that doesn't have to be scheduled under PR." He was still angry. He expected to remain angry for a long time, the way a bruise kept its ugly shading until it healed on its own schedule. But the anger had softened into something more complicated, a question. Could he accept help from someone who had hurt him? Could he trust that a promotion earned through work would not always carry the aftertaste of humiliation? "I'm trying to understand how you decided this way was acceptable," he said. "I need to know you've thought about what it does to people. Not just efficiency, not just numbers, people." She nodded, and something in her chest seemed to relieve itself as she said the truth. "I know. I am trying to be better at being human. Being a CEO doesn't absolve me of being cruel. It doesn't make my choices less painful, but I can try to correct them." They talked like that for a long time, about limits and apologies, about how to keep boundaries in a relationship that might one day be something more. They both agreed, in the quiet, that transparency would be their refuge. Apostles of policy and common sense, they decided to go to Marta first thing in the morning. The idea of formal disclosure felt ridiculous and tender at once. Love and the HR department confessed side by side. "Would you be okay telling her that you want to transfer away from my direct team?" Laura asked. "I don't want you to be in a position of being supervised by someone who also has personal feelings involved." Gabriel pictured himself reporting to someone else, the drama of his life removed from his title. The thought was relieving. It made the promotion feel less like a trap and more like an opportunity. "Yes," he said, "if that's what it takes to keep things clear." When he woke the next morning, sunlight tiptoed across the floorboards and found Luna's sneakers in the hall. He dressed slowly, the packet a dull throb of responsibility in his bag. He felt the boardroom's chill like a memory he couldn't erase. But there was also a new current, that small, promising warmth from the night before when laughter had filled their tiny kitchen like a new paint. At work, Marta met them in her office, stacks of personnel folders around her like a fortress of careful intent. She listened while they laid out the truth plainly. The firing test, the apology, the promotion, the dinner, the affection that had started like a rumor and was now a fact that needed protocol. "First," Marta said, "we acknowledge the wrong." She took notes as if she were carving out space for something fragile. "We will post a public correction about the method used. We will not use the humiliation as a tale of triumph. Second, transparency. We'll file a disclosure in which you both state there is a personal relationship that could create a power imbalance. Third,
A mitigation plan. Gabriel, we'll move you to a role that reports to another director. We'll make sure your promotion is based on your work and has a clear, written justification. Gabriel felt relief unfold with each procedural step. Rules, he had learned, are sometimes the scaffolding a relationship needs until trust can stand on its own. Marta's careful language made him feel protected in a way that surprised him. "And if people ask," Laura asked, the edge back in her voice. "Then we answer with the truth," Marta said. "No theatrics, no sugar. The CEO made a regrettable choice. You'll both sign a statement detailing how it will be handled, and HR will monitor the reporting lines for 6 months." Gabriel signed forms like a man signing off on different parts of his life. Each scribble was a tether to the world that had always demanded numbers, performance, predictable arcs. The forms made the private public in a way that both embarrassed and comforted him. They were agreements, promises printed on paper for all to see. After the meeting, a handful of colleagues congratulated him in ways that felt like soft landing mats, some sincere, some tinged with curiosity. Laura stood at a safe distance, her hands in her pockets, eyes on him with an intensity that missed the simplicity of his home where everything made sense because his daughter made it so. Days slipped into a strange new rhythm. He learned how robustly intrusive office gossip could be. He learned also how careful loyalty could move in quiet undercurrents. Laura kept her distance at work in the ways that mattered. No private emails about weekends, no sudden tenderness in memos. Marta kept her watchful eye. Gabriel adjusted to the new title, to the expanded responsibilities, to the larger paycheck that suddenly made practical worries seem smaller. He used the insurance to talk to a dentist he'd been avoiding. He set up a college savings account with amusement that felt almost foreign, adulting in broad daylight. At home, Laura became a visitor in the best possible sense. She came for school plays and parent-teacher nights, awkward at first, but learning the choreography of a small child's life. Where the toothbrushes live, how Luna preferred her cereal, which cartoons she liked.
She showed up, not as an emblem of the company, but as a person who stumbled and adapted, who could braid a tantrum with the same competence she used to decipher quarterly reports. There was a moment, a small ritual, that Gabriel would later remember as the beginning in earnest. It was a rainy Saturday when their trio decided to build a fort from spare blankets and couch cushions. Luna was the appointed queen of the fortress, directing operations with a solemnity that commanded obedience. Laura crawled under the fortress like an unpracticed child, laughing as if the world had yielded to a small joy she hadn't known she needed. Inside that blanket world, Luna doled out roles with the severity of monarchs. Gabriel was minister of silly songs. Laura was keeper of blankets. The three of them huddled in a dim little universe and passed a flashlight back and forth while Luna told stories she had invented. The sound of Laura's laugh in that cramped dark space was unfamiliar but welcome. It sounded like someone discovering a muscle they didn't know they had. When the flashlight slipped and landed on their faces, Gabriel saw the soft outline of Laura's cheek, the way her jaw relaxed when she smiled freely, the traces of worry at the corner of her eyes. He felt an appreciation come at a slow boil, tempered by the knowledge of how easily trust could be bruised. He reached out, in the secret privacy of the fort, and his thumb brushed the back of her hand. It was a small, innocent contact, and yet it felt like the most honest agreement of all, that whatever had started in the jagged knives of a boardroom could, with care, be folded into the gentle bills of domestic life. They had not agreed to a future yet, not in words that mattered. They had agreed to be honest with HR, to limit any potential fallout, to protect Luna's emotional world. They had also, without ceremony or overt declarations, decided to let tenderness grow slowly, like a plant coaxed out from beneath the winter soil. But the world is never without its shadows. Even as they stitched the edges of their life together, dinners that went late, afternoons at the park, Laura learning Luna's favorite one-liners, the memory of the public humiliation lived like a small, stubborn stone in Gabriel's pocket. He would find himself replaying that moment in the boardroom, feeling again the keen edge of it. He could forgive, perhaps, but forgetting required a generosity from someone else that he had not yet received. And there were other, quieter doubts. Co-workers who watched with speculation, a board that still hungered for performance, and the knowledge that love and power have an unsteady geometry. The promotion had changed his life in real ways, the kind that paid bills and stabilized schedules. But it had also produced a fragile web in which two lives began to bind in ways that demanded more than private resolve. They demanded public courage, policy, and the slow accrual of integrity. On a Tuesday evening, after Luna had been tucked in, and after the dishes had been rinsed, Laura stood at the apartment window, watching the city lights spill like a slow constellation. Gabriel leaned on the counter beside her, the scrape of the metal under his palm a small anchor. "Do you regret it?" he asked softly. He didn't mean the promotion, he meant everything. The test, the methods, the things said and undone. Laura closed her eyes for a beat, breathing the apartment's faint scent of lemon and laundry. "Every day," she said. "And not because I wish I had failed, because I wish I'd found a different way to learn what I needed to know. Power sometimes makes you think nobility comes from outcomes rather than methods. I need to learn the moral discipline to do both." He wanted to tell her that he believed her, to hand over forgiveness like a small shining coin. Instead, he rested his forehead on the cool glass and let himself be held by the quiet. "Then show me," he said. "Show me, don't tell me, so I know that when I look back one day, I see the change." She turned to him, and in the lamplight there was a vulnerability he had not yet seen when the cameras were off and the press releases unsigned. "I'll try," she whispered. "Not for the company, not for the board. For you, for Luna." Outside, the city hummed, indifferent and alive. Inside, in the small, ordinary amphitheater of the kitchen, two adults navigated the fragile architecture of new affection built on the ruins of a painful demonstration. The work ahead would be long, procedural, and sometimes painful. It would require them to be honest in ways that felt alarmingly public. It would require forgiveness and a patience so deep it could be called a kind of bravery. They had taken the first steps, an apology, a signed disclosure, a transfer, laughter in a child-made fort. These were necessary things, anchors in a shifting sea. But they were not sufficient. Trust, Gabriel knew, was not a document to be filed, it was a life to be lived. As Laura left that evening, the sound of her footsteps receding in the stairwell like a melody that would need to be learned again, Gabriel felt both fear and a tentative hope. He held the thin weight of his daughter's photograph in his pocket and thought of the life he wanted to build, not a fortress against the world, but a home that would hold more than fear. He turned off the lights, the apartment settling into its small, perfect darkness, and for a long time he listened to Luna breathing in sleep, to the city breathing far beyond the window. The boardroom remained a memory, the promotion a new fact. Between them lay the work of mending and the possibility of something like love, fragile and exacting and real. The morning after the boardroom episode, and the night of blankets and whispered promises, slipped into a kind of ordinary miracle. The steady cadence of breakfasts, the little ritual of Luna finding her backpack and attempting to jam too many toys into it, Laura showing up on parent nights with an awkward bouquet of store-bought flowers because she was learning the choreography of small affirmations. For a while, the most urgent dramas were who would bring cookies to class and whether Luna's raincoat still fit. Gabriel moved through those weeks with the peculiar doubling of his life, the gravity of a new title at an office that still smelled of recycled air, and the gravity of a daughter whose needs arrived in sticky, luminous bursts. He learned to take calls while rinsing cereal bowls, to sign an email and sign a permission slip in the same breath. The promotion's practical edges, better benefits, a cushion against surprise bills, settled like usable armor. The humiliation he had worn that day in the glass room had faded at the edges, but left a faint ache, the sort that taught him to be more careful with both his own heart and the hearts of others.
They handled the workplace side with the formality MARTA required: disclosures filed, reporting lines adjusted, a public correction that read like a bandage: necessary, antiseptic. The office settled into a new normal where Laura kept her distance in ways that mattered. When she walked past Gabriel at work, there was no private briefing, no small gifts or texts about weekends. There was a professional courtesy that felt honest and, oddly, protective. Marta's presence was a constant soft enforcement. She moved like a lighthouse keeper who checked the beams when storms approached. They molded their domestic life with similar carefulness. Laura learned which cartoons Luna refused to miss, and that Luna preferred her peanut butter and jelly sandwiches cut diagonally, not in squares. Gabriel learned from Laura how to plan for long-term health care, and from Luna how to make a paper crown that was unarguably regal. The little rituals, the way Luna insisted on a kiss behind the ear before school, the way they held hands under the blanket fort, became scaffolding for something gentler than they had known to expect. So when the letter arrived, it fell with the force of weather. It was not an email, not a message from a lawyer's assistant, but a certified envelope that arrived with the authority of the legal world itself. Gabriel found it on the doormat, the rectangular weight of it already cold in his hand. His name was on the front in block letters. The return address belonged to a law firm he had never seen, a name he had never heard. Inside was a filing, a petition for custody, filed by Gabriel Santos. It was clinical in its syntax and blunt in its consequences. She claimed rights as Luna's biological mother. She requested custody, or at minimum, increased visitation.
There were dates: her return to town, her claims of having addressed the difficulties that had led to her earlier departure, assertions that she had entered into treatment, that she had found stable housing, that she wished to be a part of Luna's life again. Gabriel read it twice, then 3 times, while the apartment hummed with the distant sound of a bus braking outside. His hands were steady, shock contained in a practical kind of panic. Part of him felt the old, familiar cold, the raw, small arithmetic of their life together. Rent, school, dental checkups that could be disrupted by one legal filing. Part of him felt something older and sharper, a small, private grief that had never fully healed, a child's abandonment returned in neat legal terms. He called his mother first, because she was always the place words found when they wanted to be less lonely. She arrived within the hour, a steady presence whose voice was full of both worry and pragmatic calm. They sat at the small kitchen table with Luna at school and the packet between them like a small, ugly artifact. "You did what you needed to do," his mother said, without a sermon. "You raised our girl, you gave her a life." "And what if she wins?" Gabriel asked, though he knew the legal truth was never so simple. What if some judge sees the names on a piece of paper and thinks biology is everything? His mother put a hand on his. "Courts look at where the child is safe, where the child is known. You have photos, the teacher's notes, medical records. We will get a lawyer. We'll show them that Luna is loved and provided for." The lawyer they found was a woman named Alina Morales, who had a way of speaking like she was arranging the truth in tidy stacks. She listened without interruption while Gabriel explained the chronology of Julia's departure 5 years earlier, the sparse attempts at contact, the abrupt silence that had become a kind of old grief. Alina took notes with a pencil that moved as if it were carving out a strategy. "This isn't one-dimensional," Alina said. "Biological parentage gives standing, yes, but judges also weigh the child's established living environment. Your record as a caregiver matters. School enrollments, pediatrician visits, testimonies from witnesses. We need to be measured here. We prepare for the contention, and we also prepare for settlement. Courts often like to see parents who are willing to cooperate for the child's well-being. That can actually help you if the other party genuinely wants the same." Gabriel left with a list: copies to gather, forms to sign, witnesses to call. He contacted Gabriel's mother, Luna's preschool teacher Miss Paula, and Marta, who had already become an informal guardian of sorts. Laura, when he told her, listened in silence at his kitchen table, the coffee cup between her hands making a small island of warmth.
"I will come to court," she said. "I will tell the truth. I will say what I have done for Luna and for you.
And I will be honest about my mistake with the test. The judge needs context." Gabriel was careful in how he answered. He did not want Laura to step into a scene for which her presence might be used as an accusation of undue influence. He also knew the weight of having someone who could bear witness to what she had seen: his steady caregiving, his small acts of relentless attention. "If you speak, speak to what you know," he told her, "not to how you feel about me. Kids need truth, not dramas." On the day of the first hearing, the courthouse smelled like a place that had swallowed 1,000 human confessions. Scents of coffee, polished wood, the soft metallic taste of litigation. Julia was there, thinner than the file suggested, eyes puffy but resolute. The judge who presided wore a look of patient familiarity with human failings. The courtroom filled with an audience of people whose lives would never be the same for having been present. Elena argued calmly, pulling together a narrative that emphasized continuity: school enrollment forms showing Gabriel's primary contact, immunization records, teachers' notes that recorded him as the primary caregiver, and testimony from the pediatrician that Luna's treatment and appointments had been managed by Gabriel. There were photographs: Luna's first day of preschool, Luna on a playground with Gabriel making a rabbit-shaped sandwich, Luna tucked into the sofa with a scraped knee, Gabriel's hand pressed to her forehead. Each image was a small confession of ordinary parenthood. Julia's attorney presented a different kind of story: a woman who acknowledged her absence but insisted she had been in treatment and was now stable. He offered evidence of the program she had attended, a letter from her counselor, a lease for an apartment with a new address, and her willingness to be evaluated and monitored. She testified with a voice that cracked sometimes, apologizing for past absences and insisting on her love for Luna. She spoke of how motherhood had felt like a geography she had left by mistake, and how she wanted to return to its map. The judge, a person who had seen the contours of family cruelty and redemption many times, listened. There was an unspoken law in that small room: the child's welfare must come first. The judge asked questions bluntly: about stability, about evidence of rehabilitation, about the nature of the abandonment. To Julia, the judge asked what had really changed, and whether she had the support system necessary to sustain parenting. A child psychologist, an assessor appointed by the court, filed a report recommending supervised visitation at first. The psychologist's assessment noted Luna's secure attachment to Gabriel and her tentative curiosity toward Julia. It stated that sudden, unsupervised contact could be destabilizing, and that a measured reintroduction would be in Luna's best interest. The document did not pretend to finality. It recommended re-evaluation once Julia demonstrated consistent stability and parenting readiness. The judge's ruling was practical, if heavy. Supervised visits to commence immediately under the auspices of a court-approved agency, with a review scheduled in 3 months. No change in custody would be ordered without more evidence of Julia's sustained rehabilitation. The ruling acknowledged Julia's parental rights, but prioritized Luna's established living situation. After the hearing, when Gabriel stepped onto the courthouse steps and felt the afternoon sun like a benediction, the relief was not the kind that erased fear. It was a brittle truce, protective but provisional. He thought of the possibility of seeing Julia at the visitation center, of Luna's small face when confronted with a mother she had not known for 5 years. He thought of Laura waiting for him at the curb, a phone in her hand, ready for him to call. "It will take time," Laura said as soon as he could speak. "We will go slowly, and we'll let Luna set the pace." The first supervised visit was small and structured. An attendant from the agency met them at a neutral, child-friendly space where toys were bright and tables small. Julia arrived with a neat bag and a face that tried to be composed. Luna's confusion when she first saw Julia was a precise, painful thing. Gabriel stood close but did not intervene. He watched as Luna's curiosity slowly unfolded like a flower under gentle warmth.
A tentative question, then a tentative reach for a hand, then the tentative sharing of a juice box offered by Julia and politely refused with a child's bluntness. The attendant mediated with a tone practiced and kind, encouraging play and gentle conversation. Luna was curious and careful. She asked Julia about a small stuffed rabbit she found in the toy corner. Julia answered, voice steadier than the first few days. After half an hour, Luna returned to Gabriel in a way that had nothing to do with allegiance and everything to do with belonging. She crawled into Gabriel's lap, tucked her head into his side like a small ship finding a harbor, and the attendant noted it with the impartiality of professional observation. Those visits continued with the slow, cautious forward movement of someone learning a new language. Julia showed up on time, she attended the recommended therapy sessions, she took parenting classes and produced certificates. The visiting center filed reports. Julia was consistent, she showed remorse, she engaged with Luna in child-appropriate ways, and she was trying to build the stable life she said she wanted. Some reports praised progress, some noted the deep work still needed. Gabriel read them with a heart wary but softening in places that had been hardened by years of absence. At the same time, life went on.
There were moments of tenderness with Laura that felt less fraught now that the initial shock had been processed in 1,000 small formalities. They found themselves in the kitchen sharing a quiet moment after a supervised visit that had gone well. Luna was asleep. The apartment hummed with the slow contentment of a house where dishes waited to be rinsed. Laura slid a mug across the counter to Gabriel, and in that ordinary exchange there was something like a pact. "You did well today," she said. "You were present and steady. Kids read steadiness more easily than speeches." Gabriel looked at her, at the way her jaw held the residue of worry, at the way her hand shook slightly when she reached for the pastry. "You did too," he answered. "You didn't overstep. You kept it about Luna." Laura nodded. "It isn't my place to take any more space than you offer. I should never have made it harder." The months that followed shifted from legal contortions to the slow labor of human restoration. Julia's therapist, when she spoke, described progress that was not linear but real. Attendance at group therapy, consistent housing, a new job with predictable hours. She wrote letters, measured, apologetic, describing what she had done wrong and what she intended to do to make amends. Julia apologized directly to Gabriel in a mediated session, voice small but firm, acknowledging the damage she had done by leaving and asking for the chance to be present without taking Luna away. Those apologies were specific, not theatrical. Therapy specifics, intended steps, willingness to accept supervision. There was no grand flourish, only the steady, grubby work of proving reliability. In mediation, where a neutral facilitator sat with lists and calendars and an eye for compromise, Julia proposed a schedule of visits that allowed her to be part of Luna's life in a way that respected the bond forged in the 5 years she had missed. Her proposal included regular supervised sessions, a plan to transition to unsupervised visits after a probationary period if her progress held, and a condition that she would take part in family therapy to learn how to coexist with Gabriel and his household structure. Gabriel listened to the proposal with a tenderness that surprised him. He had imagined himself as an immovable wall. Instead, he found himself measuring entrances and exits like a man setting new locks. He asked for guarantees, written documentation of Julia's continued treatment, regular reports to the court, a gradual increase in visitation contingent on assessments. He wanted Luna's stability preserved above all, and he wanted Julia's path back to motherhood to be one with accountability. In the mediation room, Julia's voice trembled but did not break. "I don't expect anything to be easy," she said. "I know I hurt you, and I hurt our daughter. I can't take back what's done. All I can do is try to be honest and present now." That honesty, coupled with the court's cautious oversight, created a path that was not a victory, but a negotiation. Julia would not be granted immediate custody, and the court would maintain oversight. The agreement called for supervised visits at first, then reevaluation. It called for Julia to continue therapy for a year and undergo parenting classes. It required that she maintain stable employment and housing, and it stipulated the court's authority to revise terms if evidence suggested any risk to Luna's well-being. It was, in legal terms, a compromise. In human terms, it was a beginning shaped by careful boundaries. As these pragmatic steps took place, the emotional terrain between Gabriel and Laura continued to deepen in ways that were cautious and real. They shared more moments that were softer than they had anticipated. Early mornings making pancakes, Laura learning to braid Luna's hair, Gabriel learning to navigate the unfamiliar world of CO partners who carried private griefs like currency. Laura's vulnerabilities were not dramatic reveals so much as small, honest exposures. Her inability to relax when she wasn't in control, the loneliness that had lived in the corners of big offices, the grief she carried for her own mother who had died when she was young. He asked her about her childhood one night in the small porch light of his apartment, Luna asleep in her room and the city holding its breath beyond the glass. "You carry a lot by yourself," he said, not a judgment, but a recognition. "I didn't know how to ask for help," she replied. "I thought power was the way to make the world safe. I was wrong. Power without a moral compass can be a very lonely place. When I saw you stand up like that, dignity under pressure, I realized I wanted someone who navigated life by different coordinates." Their romance unfolded in small increments: a hand brushed in the hallway, a protective squeeze when Luna scraped her knee at the playground, a real kiss in the kitchen that was unexpected in its gentleness. They were careful with public displays, mindful of the HR policies that had been written and the sensitivity of their positions. Marta's watchful presence and the formal disclosure they had signed were constant reminders that their tenderness needed boundaries. They honored those constraints with a seriousness that made their private moments feel like a fragile, ethical luxury. Yet life did not permit them to remain ever cautious. The question of a deeper commitment, of blending a family and making promises in the world rather than only in whispers, eventually arrived, like the tide. It arrived on a day that had no ceremony. They had spent the morning at a school fundraiser, Luna carrying a little paper lantern she had made, proud beyond measure. They had come back to the apartment exhausted and hilarious with the trivialities of life: a sofa cushion misplacement, a plant that needed watering. Laura stood in the kitchen holding a mug that had cracked down the rim. The everyday domesticity of the scene knocked the air out of Gabriel in the softest way. "Do you ever think about," Gabriel began, and then stopped because the thought felt too exposed. "What family could look like?" Laura suggested, finishing his sentence. "Yes." They talked, not in vows, but in the pragmatic language that had become their dialect. They spoke of legal protections for Luna, of how they would structure their lives to avoid the inequalities of power that had once been misused, of how they would build a home where both adults were accountable. They spoke of marriage, not as destination, but as a methodical agreement to build institutions of care, to be witness for each other in a small public way. "I don't need a grand proposal," Gabriel said, smiling. "I need someone who chooses me in public as well as private." "And I need someone who will keep me honest," Laura replied. "Someone who will make me go to therapy when I'm stubborn, someone who will stand for the people I forget to notice." So they built the first promise in a quiet way. Gabriel found a small ring, a plain band with a tiny dent he liked because it looked used, like life had already begun to shape it. He wrapped it in a napkin and waited for a day when the world felt ordinary enough to hold such an important question. He knelt on the living room rug, no grand gesture, no kneeling on marble, and held out the ring. Luna, quick to sense drama, came over and declared, with the solemnity of a child officiant, "You have to kiss first if you want to be married." They kissed, awkward and fierce, and then Laura said yes in a way that had both a laugh and a vow buried in it. They did not rush the public announcement. There were conversations with Marta and with Elena, legal questions to make sure the union would not complicate custody proceedings. Protections were drafted, a premarital arrangement that spelled out custody safeguards and financial transparency. They signed things that made some of their love practical and adult,
But the paperwork felt more like scaffolding than a prison. Ways to ensure Luna's security and to prevent the past misuses of power from becoming new harms. Meanwhile, Julia's progress continued, and the supervised visits began to show tentative warmth. She developed a rhythm with Luna, reading the same book slowly over again, learning Luna's favorite silly noises that made her laugh, bringing a small, considerate snack that Luna would accept with a child's curiosity. The court psychologist's reports noted improvement. Julia's attendance was consistent. She showed a slower, steadier capacity for emotion in the presence of her daughter. She enrolled in parenting classes and maintained therapy appointments. The court scheduled a review. On the day of the review, the courtroom filled with the smell of spring sunlight that seemed to seep even through oak panels.
The psychologist presented observations that were cautious optimism. Luna's attachment to Gabriel remained secure, but she also showed increasing ease with Julia when visits had been consistent. The psychologist recommended a gradual extension of visitation, conditional on continued treatment. The judge deferred to the assessments, but emphasized that any changes would be incremental and subject to ongoing oversight. And yet, even as the legal world moved toward the practical adjudications it was designed for, something happened in human terms that no court could mandate. Julia, sitting in the gallery while the proceedings were described, met Gabriel's eyes across a gulf that had once been silence and saw not an enemy, but a man who had raised her child without complaint. There was an understanding between them that had been forged not by litigation, but by the slow exchange of proof, of therapy notes, of consistent visits, of small apologies offered in private. In the meeting that followed the court hearing, Julia spoke not of law, but of shame. "I am so sorry," she said, voice small. "I know I have no right to ask for more than you can bear. I want to be part of Luna's life, but I don't want to damage what you have made. If it hurts her to have me more, I will step back. I don't want to take her from you. I want to earn the chance to be a mother she can rely on." Her words landed between them like a fragile bridge. Gabriel listened. He remembered nights alone with Luna when he had feared the world would swallow them. He remembered the rawness of being abandoned. But he also had watched Julia labor to rebuild herself. He had seen the certificates, the attendance lists, the steady steps toward responsibility. He felt a complicated compassion for the woman who had been lost and found again. "We will not let Luna be the instrument of our pain," Gabriel said finally. "We will be careful. We will ask the court and the therapist to guide the process. But if you are willing to accept these terms, therapy, consistency, and time, then we can try." Julia nodded, then reached out with a small, trembling hand to touch Gabriel's sleeve in a gesture that did not seek ownership but recognition. "Thank you," she whispered. Over months, the visits lengthened. They shifted from the institutional spaces to public parks, to short, supervised afternoons at Gabriel's apartment with a professional present who would sit on the edge of the couch unobtrusively and take notes. Julia learned Luna's small idiosyncrasies, how she made a snail sound when concentrating, the way her foot wiggled when she was excited. She attended school recitals, always arriving a little earlier than required, rehearsed, anxious, but present. She sent small gifts sometimes, a handmade bracelet, a tiny book. Luna accepted them with a child's generosity, not a child's obligation. As Julia became steadier, she faced a personal reckoning. Her therapist guided her to understand that being a parent now required a different mode than the fantasy she had once held. It required routine, reliability, the daily patience of showing up. She signed continued participation in therapy and accepted that the court's oversight might continue for a time. She even, in a mediated conversation, wrote a letter to Gabriel that was more than an apology. It was a promise of accountability. She offered to allow monitoring and to accept a schedule that placed Luna's well-being before any hurt. At one of the family therapy sessions, where they all sat around a small table with tissues and a box of crayons that Luna used more thoughtfully than the adults, Julia surprised them by speaking not only for herself, but for the future. "I will not try to take Luna from her life with you," she said, voice steadying. I want to be her mother in a way that adds to her life, not one that takes from it. If that means being a consistent visiting parent, someone Luna can rely on for love and stability, then that is what I will be." There were tears from more than one corner of the room. The therapist, a woman who had learned to recognize the currency of small acts, suggested a phased plan: increased visitation contingent on continued therapy, co-parenting classes, and a shared calendar with the agreement that any relocation of Luna would require mutual consent or a court order. It was a pragmatic design that also contained the seeds of reconciliation. The months ahead were not without relapse or fear. There were nights when Julia did not appear for a visit, days when the anxiety of the court review returned like a tremor. Each failure required attention, each success required acknowledgement. But slowly, the rhythm of shared lives took shape. Laura and Gabriel learned to craft a co-parenting architecture that included Julia without erasing the years Gabriel had sustained alone. They arranged family schedules, shared information, and kept Luna's sense of safety at the center. Laura never took Julia's presence as a threat. She saw it as an expansion, and sometimes chimed in with the pragmatic warmth of someone who had once feared power would make her cruel and later chose to make power accountable. The story moved, in time, toward a quiet resolution, neither wholly legal nor wholly romantic, but somewhere between. Julia, after long and measured progress, signed an agreement that granted Gabriel primary custody while offering her a robust, structured role in Luna's life: regular parenting time, inclusion in major decisions where appropriate, and a clear commitment to maintain therapy and demonstrate stability. The court approved the plan as measured and child-centered. It was not a full restoration of what might have been 5 years ago, but it was a negotiated peace that prioritized Luna's equilibrium. Julia, for her part, accepted the arrangement with a humility that felt like reform and not surrender. She had learned that motherhood was a continuing act of presence. There were smaller victories that mattered more than the legal formality. A year into the process, Luna drew a family portrait that did not erase the past. It showed 3 stick figures holding hands, each labeled. She insisted they hang it in the living room. Gabriel and Laura put it in a frame and placed it on the mantel like the tangible proof of a life repaired by choices rather than absolution. They celebrated that year, not with a big party, but with a dinner where Julia came and brought a humble, earnest dish. They all sat at the table, 3 adults and a child, passing food and small stories across the plates. The conversation was careful and grown-up. Jokes, small grievances aired and met with apologies, an exchange of gratitude for the small guardianship of a child's life. Luna laughed, oblivious to the past's teeth. She made a small toast with her juice box. "To cookies," she declared, and everyone laughed, because a child's priorities are always clearer and more merciful than the adult ones. Another change was more private and, to Gabriel, more terrifyingly honest. He had come to understand what marriage might entail, a public declaration of commitment that would make a social claim on their life. He felt naked at the thought of making such a claim before the world, but he also felt the peculiar urge to mark their decision not only with a ring, but with a ceremony that would include the people who had been witness and support through the last tumultuous year. They planned something small, a garden wedding in an intimate backyard behind a community center, a place where Luna often played. Invitations were limited to immediate family, a handful of friends, Marta, Elena, and the pediatrician who had been a quiet ally. Julia accepted the invitation with a grace that had become part of her new pattern. She would not undo the architecture of Gabriel's life. She would stand as an invited guest who had earned a seat by the labor of consistency. The wedding day was humid in a way that made the air feel tactile, like something you could fold into your hands. The yard was strung with simple lights that looked at dusk like a constellation someone had carefully packed for them. Luna, wearing a dress with daisies, insisted on being part of everything and was appointed honorary coordinator of the flower petals. Gabriel's mother pressed a hand to his shoulder with a look that said everything she had been through and everything she had hoped. Laura walked down the makeshift aisle in a dress that was not showy but exact.
The kind of clothes she would have once dismissed as unimportant, but now wore with clear intention. Gabriel watched her approach with eyes that had learned to read the small signs of someone who had grown braver.
When they stood beneath a simple arch, the officiant, an old teacher who had taught Laura in high school and had been invited because the choice felt right, spoke of promises as acts, not only words. They exchanged vows that were less about romantic flourish and more about the commitments that had kept them afloat. To hold the other's mistakes with grace, to be accountable when power tempted cruelty, to protect Luna's emotional world with more care than any ambition required. Gabriel promised to keep his daughter's life steady and to share his heart honestly. Laura promised to keep her power tempered with humility and to protect the young life in which she had been invited. They sealed their vows with a kiss that tasted of salt and laughter, a quiet, private consecration of a life neither of them could have predicted when "you're fired" had sounded like a sentence. Julia came forward during the reception to hug them both. The gesture was awkward and sincere. Luna looked on with the untroubled curiosity of a child who had decided that hugs were better than bitter feelings. Later, when she woke in the morning with the ghost of music in her ears, Luna found a small note left by Julia. "Thank you for letting me be part of this day." It was a simple sentence. It meant more than either woman had words for. Life after the wedding was not a fairy tale. It was simply steadier. They learned the rhythms of blended life. Parenting conferences, school recitals, late-night repairs of bathroom leaks, the small economies of compromise that make a family possible. They built rituals, pancakes on Sunday, library trips on rainy afternoons, small annual celebrations that marked the life they had chosen together. There were moments that tested them still. Power dynamics did not evaporate because two people signed papers. Laura still navigated the pressures of her role at work. Gabriel still faced whispers about whether his promotion had always been merit or something else. But they had built procedures, open disclosures, regular check-ins with Marta, a professional counselor who met with them when the past's sharp edges reappeared. They agreed on no surprises. Any career decisions that might affect the family would be discussed and planned publicly, in ways that respected both workplace ethics and domestic stability. Julia, for her part, became a consistent presence without attempting to erase the past. She took up a small craft business that allowed her a predictable schedule. She continued therapy, and she cultivated a relationship with Luna that was patient and grounded. She did not seek to buy affection with grand gestures. Instead, she learned to be present on a list of ordinary days. In return, Luna taught her the lesson that trust is often given in increments, not sums. Years later, the family would look back and trace one line to that glass-walled boardroom where the words, "You're fired," had been spoken. It was not a neat origin. It was messy and ethically compromised, an ugly test that had been poorly conceived and badly executed. Laura never excused it, and the company never allowed it to be celebrated. She had apologized many times, publicly and privately, and she had rewritten a number of company policies to ensure that no one else would be subject to the same cruelty disguised as a leadership litmus test. But that day, paradoxically, had also set in motion a different kind of proof. It revealed character under pressure in more than one person, forced conversations about power and humility, and drove a series of choices that led to an expanded family bound not simply by blood, but by the daily acts of presence. Gabriel learned that dignity could withstand humiliation. Laura learned that authority required moral apprenticeship. Julia learned that motherhood was a long, patient craft of showing up. Luna learned, as children do, how complex adults could be and still love her. She learned that families were sometimes reassembled from pieces with time and care. On a late autumn afternoon several winters after the first confrontation, Gabriel stood in the small backyard behind the house where they had planted a lemon tree the first summer they had married. Luna, now older, with a more self-conscious laugh, practiced cartwheels on the grass, while Julia, Laura, and Gabriel watched with the kind of bland gratitude that comes when a child is safe. A neighbor dropped by with pies and the smell of baking, an ordinary miracle.
Gabriel thought, not for the first time, about the path that had led them there. It had been paved with uncomfortable truths and hard conversations, with forms and court dates and therapy sessions and countless small apologies that did not erase the past but made living in the present possible. It had involved legal counsel and HR disclosures and public corrections. It had also involved, in equal part, the stubborn decision of 3 adults to place the child's well-being above their own bruised egos. He sat on the steps and watched Luna's shadow, elongated by the late sun, and felt something like peace. It was not a simple peace. It was threaded with memory and a vigilance that had not disappeared. He looked at Laura, who was laughing at something Julia had said, and at Julia, who looked younger in the way people do when they are learning how to become better versions of themselves. They were messy and whole in equal measure. When the day folded into dusk and Luna's laughter settled into the hush of sleep, they gathered in the living room and swapped stories about the day. There was a comfort in the way they moved around each other, an unspoken vow that they would keep building this life with the care of people who had learned that love is not only feeling, but an array of choices enacted over and over.
Later, alone for a moment by the window, Gabriel held the small ring she had accepted 5 years ago and turned it in his fingers. The metal had acquired a faint sheen from the life it had been part of. He thought of the 3 words that had started it all, and, with a twist of bitter humor that had long since ceased to be raw, he allowed himself to admit how odd it felt to have a house filled with people who loved him precisely because they had seen him steady his child's life when the world had threatened it. He had been tested that day in the boardroom. He had passed, not because the test had been fair, but because he had chosen dignity. Laura had been tested too, by the moral reckoning of power, and she had chosen to be accountable. Julia had been tested by the need to rebuild from an absence, and she had chosen, slowly and imperfectly, to try. What had changed everything was not a single act of generosity or a dramatic reversal. It was a sequence of decisions made over and over, apologies spoken and shown, policies rewritten, therapy attended, small visits accepted, a child's curiosity honored. It was how people kept choosing what was hardest, the steady, unglamorous labor of putting another's well-being above one's pride. If this story moved you, consider liking and subscribing for more true-to-life stories about resilience, responsibility, and the strange, tender forms love can take.